Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you bring, articles, reports, all sorts of material, and really unpack the key insights hidden inside.
And today, we're digging into something you specifically asked us to look at. This collection of documents all focused on Operation Sindoor.
Exactly. Our job really is to figure out what this operation was, why it happened, how it went down, and, what the fallout and bigger picture looks like.
And critically, we're sticking only to the information in the sources you've provided. No outside speculation, just what the materials say. It's about getting past the noise.
Right, not just a news report, but understanding the layers, finding those details maybe others missed, all based on your documents.
Okay, so where do we start? The sources point to a very specific, very tragic event as the trigger.
They do. It's that awful terror attack in Pahalgam.
Yeah.
Happened April 22nd, 2025, in the Baizaran Valley, Jammu and Kashmir.
And the details in these sources, they're tough. 26 civilians killed, 25 Indians, one Nepali national. And the group blamed is the Resistance Front, the TRF.
Which the sources describe as like a front group for Lashkar-e-Taiba or Laiti.
Yeah, a proxy. But here's a detail the sources really emphasize, and it seems key to the whole thing.
The way they targeted people.
Exactly. The deliberate segregation and, execution of non-Muslim male tourists. The sources specifically mention this, created instant widows, shattering families right there.
Horrific. And it's that specific act, that targeted brutality, that your sources identify as the direct, the immediate reason for launching Operation Sindoor.
Right. Which, brings us to the name itself, Sindoor.
Which, for anyone listening who might not know, is the red vermilion powder, a powerful symbol in Hindu tradition, often worn by married women.
And the sources you gave us, they highlight this dual symbolism. It's quite complex.
How so?
Well, on one side, it directly references the grief, right? The widows created by the attack. The sources even mention the imagery of spilled Sindoor looking like blood. It's very visceral.
Well, there's another side to it.
Yes. The sources also frame it as a symbol of India's resolve, like a vow to fight back against terrorism, protect its people. So it's grief and defiance intertwine, presented as a very deliberate, very resonant choice.
Okay, so understanding that tragic context, that powerful name, what were the actual goals of Operation Sindoor, according to the materials? What were they trying to achieve?
The sources are pretty clear on the objectives. First, the most direct one, neutralize terrorist infrastructure. Meaning going after specific training camps, command centers, hubs linked to Liti, but also Jaish-e-Mohammed, JEM, and Hizbul Mujahideen, groups the sources say were actively planning more attacks.
So it wasn't just hitting back for Pahalgam, it was trying to preempt future attacks from multiple groups.
Exactly, proactive disruption. And that ties into the second goal, deter future attacks.
How would hitting camps deter future ones?
Well, the sources frame this as signaling a shift, a doctrinal shift, they call it. Basically, sending a message that state-sponsored terror groups allowed to operate by a state would face real targeted consequences directly.
Like drawing a new line in the sand.
That seems to be the idea presented in the sources, setting a new precedent. And the third objective they stress is minimize escalation, initially at least.
How do you minimize escalation when you're conducting military strikes?
The sources say the plan specifically avoided hitting clearly marked Pakistani military sites or purely civilian areas at first. The aim was to hit the terror groups hard, but, try not to spark a full-blown war immediately.
Okay, got it. So specific goals.
Mm-hmm.
Neutralize, deter, minimize escalation.
Yeah.
Now, the big question, how do they actually do it, the execution? What did the sources tell us?
Right, the how. Timeline is key. It kicked off overnight May 6th into May 7th, 2025. The actual strikes started somewhere between 1:05 and 1:30 a.m.
Middle of the night. And it was fast.
Very fast. The sources mention about 25 minutes for the main strike phase.
Wow. And not just one part of the military, I gather.
No, absolutely not. The sources really stress the tri-service coordination. Army, Air Force, Navy, all involved.
Okay, so how did that break down? Who did what, according to the material?
The IAF, the Air Force, they led the actual strikes. The sources mention Rafale jets, advanced weapons.
Okay, and the Navy?
Their role, as described, was presence in the Arabian Sea. Basically, kept the Pakistani Navy occupied or deterred from intervening. Pinning them down is the term used.
And the Army?
Ground forces, including special forces, were on standby, ready for any contingency, presumably. A fully coordinated effort.
That level of coordination is definitely significant. So where exactly did they hit? The sources list 9 specific locations. What jumps out about these targets?
Well, two things, really. The types of targets and their locations. Some were in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, POJK, closer to the line of control.
Like training camps?
Yeah, training camps in places like Gulpur and Sawai Nala. Also, specific locations tied to groups, like a mosque in Muzaffarabad linked to GEM, and others in Kotli and Bimber.
Okay, so targets near the border, which might be somewhat expected. What else?
But then, and this is where it gets perhaps more significant strategically, the sources detail strikes deep inside Pakistan proper, particularly in Punjab province.
How deep?
They mention Markaz Subhanallah in Bahawalpur. That's listed as 100 kilometers from the border. And other sites near Muridke and Sialkot, like Markaz Taiba, about 18 kilometers in. Another camp, Sarjal, just 6 kilometers from the border in the Sialkot sector.
Hitting targets 100 kilometers inside Punjab. That does feel like a major statement, doesn't it? Based on what the sources imply about previous actions?
The sources definitely present it that way, a signal of reach and willingness. And they connect the ability to hit these varied targets precisely to the technology and weaponry used.
Right, the tools. Let's talk about that. What kind of hardware are we talking about, according to the documents?
It was a mix. They mention SLP cruise missiles long range, good for hardened targets. Hammer precision bombs, more medium range, maybe for targets needing quick reaction.
On those drones?
Yeah, loitering munitions or kamikaze drones. The sources mention their role for real-time intel and hitting targets autonomously. Plus, BrahMos missiles are mentioned, noted for indigenous seekers, high precision.
So different tools for different jobs, essentially. And how did they pick the targets with such apparent accuracy?
Intelligence was key, according to the sources. Satellite imagery, drones for surveillance, human intelligence on the ground, all feeding into identifying the right spots, and real-time ISR, that's intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance during the op, to guide weapons and, importantly, minimize hitting unintended targets.
And what about Pakistan's defenses during the strike itself? Did the sources mention any challenges there?
The implication in the sources is that India's strike package either bypassed or somehow neutralized Pakistan's air defenses during that initial 25-minute window. It's presented as a key success factor.
Okay. But defenses came into play later.
Yes, the sources mention India using its own systems, like Akashtir and the S-400, to counter Pakistan's retaliation afterwards, things like drones and missiles launched in response. But the initial strike seems to have gotten through cleanly based on this material.
All right, okay. So we've got the trigger, the goals, the how and where. Let's move to the outcomes. What were the actual results of Operation Sindoor, as reported in these sources?
The sources report pretty significant results on the ground. Over 100 terrorists killed is the figure mentioned.
Any specific high-profile figures named?
Yes. The sources explicitly name Abdul Rauf Azhar. He's described as a major GEM leader, linked to things like the IC-814 hijacking back in '99 and the killing of Daniel Pearl.
Wow, okay. That's a significant name.
Definitely. The sources also report, interestingly, that 10 family members of the GEM chief, Masood Azhar, were reportedly killed in the strikes as well.
So a direct hit on the leadership structures, it sounds like.
That's how the sources frame it. And strategically, they emphasize this, reinforces that doctrinal shift we talked about.
How so?
By hitting not just fighters, but the infrastructure, the leadership, and doing it deep inside Pakistan. The sources suggest India was basically saying the distinction between terrorists and their state sponsors is, well, no longer a shield.
And those deep strikes into Punjab are presented as proof of that.
Absolutely. The willingness to go there is highlighted as a key strategic outcome, showing resolve to hit important targets, not just those near the Losi.
And from India's military perspective, how did the operation go, according to the sources?
Sure.
Losses.
The sources state no Indian assets, aircraft, personnel were lost during the operation itself. And getting past Pakistan's air defenses is presented as, exposing vulnerabilities and showcasing India's own tech and planning.
And they tried to shape the narrative internationally, too.
Yes. The sources mention briefings for key countries, U.S., Russia, UK, UAE, Saudi Arabia. They provided evidence, apparently, linking Pakistan to the Pahalgam attack. The whole operation was framed as a legitimate act of self-defense under international norms, pointing to UN calls for accountability.
Okay, but inevitably, there was a reaction from Pakistan. What did the sources say about their response and what happened next?
Well, Pakistan's immediate public response, according to the sources, was to condemn it as an act of aggression. They claimed the Indian strikes killed 26 civilians and injured 46.
And they mentioned the UN Charter.
Yes, they invoked Article 51, claiming the right to self-defense and retaliation.
Did that retaliation happen militarily?
It did, according to the sources. On May 7th and 8th, Pakistan initiated heavy shelling across the line of control.
Resulting in casualties?
Yes. The sources report 12 Indian civilians and 1 soldier killed on the Indian side, with 51 injured. They also specifically note the targeting of a Gurdwara, a Sikh temple in Poonch.
And any other actions?
Pakistan also attempted airstrikes on Indian military targets. Locations mentioned are in J&K, Punjab, Rajasthan, Gujarat. But the sources state these were intercepted and neutralized by Indian air defenses.
So Pakistan hit back, India defended.
Yeah.
Then what? How did India respond to the shelling and attempted airstrikes?
India's counter-retaliation followed quickly on May 9th and 10th. The sources say India then struck 11 Pakistani air bases.
Air bases. That sounds like a significant escalation.
It does. The sources report these strikes destroyed roughly 20% of Pakistan's Air Force infrastructure. They even name a specific Pakistani casualty, squadron leader Usman Yusuf.
Okay, so a clear escalation and counter-escalation. But things didn't spiral completely out of control.
Apparently not. On May 10th, the sources state both sides agreed to a ceasefire.
A ceasefire. So hostilities stopped.
Yeah.
But the sources suggest that wasn't quite the end of the story for Operation Sindoor.
No, and this is crucial. India publicly stated, according to the material, that Operation Sindoor remained active.
Active? What does that mean if there's a ceasefire?
The sources interpret this as signaling a new normal. Basically, India saying things wouldn't just go back to how they were before, that normal relations depended on Pakistan fundamentally addressing the terrorism issue. The operation, in a sense, wasn't over just because the shooting stopped.
That's a really important nuance. So thinking bigger picture now, what's the overall significance of this operation based on what these sources are telling us?
I think the main thing the sources hammer home is this doctrinal shift. It set a precedent, right? India moving from potentially more restrained responses to something much more assertive, targeting the actual infrastructure supporting terror groups.
And the justification presented was?
Essentially, the sources suggest Pakistan's perceived inability or unwillingness to control these groups operating from its soil gave India the justification, in its view, to act directly.
And the name Sindoor keeps coming up as significant.
It really does. The sources note Prime Minister Modi himself chose it. The link is clearly drawn to humanizing the victims, especially the women widowed by the attack, making it resonate culturally, politically, emotionally within India. It wasn't just a military code name, it had a narrative purpose.
Did the sources mention how this played out globally? Any lessons learned?
Yeah, it definitely got international attention. Some media, the sources note, framed it almost like a tech contest, comparing the jets used, like Pakistan's reported J-10Cs versus India's Rafales.
A technology shootout angle.
Kind of. But more broadly, it's presented as showcasing India's evolving military might, this shift towards non-contact warfare, which the sources link to ongoing defense modernization efforts.
So potentially a case study for other militaries.
That's what's suggested. The speed, the precision, the multi-domain aspect, these are things military analysts globally would study. The sources even draw parallels to like a rapid response tactics seen elsewhere, mentioning Ukraine.
Now, with something like this, there are bound to be criticisms or challenges highlighted in the sources, too. What did they mention?
They do include critiques. One point raised is about the name Sindoor. Some Indian feminists, according to the sources, criticized it.
Why?
The argument reported was that it could reinforce traditional gender roles, sort of framing women primarily as victims defined by marital status rather than as individuals.
That's an important perspective highlighted in the material. Any other challenges or risks?
Well, the risk of escalation is definitely acknowledged. Even though India's initial aim was reportedly non-escalatory towards the Pakistani state, the subsequent back and forth, the shelling, the air-based strikes showed how quickly things could spiral. The sources don't mention nuclear threats this time, but the inherent danger was clear.
And the information side of things.
Oh, absolutely. The sources point to a parallel information war. India using briefings, social media to shape the narrative, provide its justification. Pakistan countering with its own claims, particularly about civilian casualties. A battle for perception alongside the military action.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Bringing together everything from these sources, what are the absolute key takeaways about Operation Sindoor?
I think based purely on this material, it's presented as a real watershed moment for India's counter-terror strategy. A mix of high-tech precision, initial calculated restraint, but ultimately a very forceful message against state-sponsored terrorism.
And it seems to have pushed boundaries quite literally.
Yeah, targeting deep inside Pakistan into Punjab is portrayed as redefining red lines, signaling that sanctuaries, no matter how far from the border, weren't safe anymore.
And the success is heavily linked in the sources to technology and intelligence.
Definitely. It's framed as proof of India's military modernization paying off, enabling these complex, high-precision operations.
And that name, Sindoor, tying it all back to the human cost and the specific nature of the triggering attack.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that emotional, cultural connection. It wasn't just abstract geopolitics, it was grounded in that specific tragedy.
And finally, that lingering point from the sources, the operation remaining active even with a ceasefire.
That's the crucial concluding thought from the material, isn't it? It suggests the ceasefire wasn't an end, but maybe a pause in a new, more confrontational phase. It highlights the ongoing fragility and the unresolved core issues, especially terrorism, in the India-Pakistan relationship.
So that was our deep dive into Operation Sindoor, really trying to pull out the core threads, the context, the implications, all drawn directly from the sources you provided.
Yeah, we've gone through the trigger, the stated goals, the step-by-step execution, the reported outcomes, the back and forth that followed, and even the symbolism and criticisms mentioned in the documents.
It certainly raises a lot of complex questions, doesn't it? About modern warfare, about deterrence theory, technology's role, and how nations use narrative and symbolism.
And maybe here's a final thought, something directly prompted by these sources for you to consider. Given that escalation cycle we discussed, and especially India's statement, reported in the sources, that Operation Sindoor remains active despite the ceasefire, what do these documents collectively suggest this new normal actually is between India and Pakistan? And how fundamentally different is it, according to this material, from the dynamic that existed before?
Lots to think about there. Keep digging into those sources, keep asking those questions. That's what this is all about.